11 a.m. So I'm excited to get started in our conversation this morning with a wonderful guest. And we'll start by welcoming you all in. Thank you for joining us on our webinar sponsored by the Portland Trailblazers. Thank you to the Portland Trailblazers for your sponsorship and support of this wonderful and meaningful work. I'm very thankful that you have joined and decided to partner with us. Also, Modus Recruiting. I am Orlando Williams, CEO and Chief Equity Officer of Modus Recruiting, and we are proud to be a sponsor of this event as well. So welcome in. Thank you for joining us. And I am very excited this morning because I have the opportunity to share with you not only an incredible mind, incredible businesswoman, an incredible professional, but someone that I can actually call friend. And so I have with me this morning, Miss Rukaiyah Adams, who is Chief Investment Officer of Meyer Memorial Trust. Welcome, Rukaiyah.
Thank you.
It is a pleasure to have you. I am going to share with all of our audience a little bit of your background, and then we'll begin some questions for you. So our itinerary this morning, so we're going to walk through career, we're going to talk about equity, we'll talk about Albina Vision Trust, and for all of you who are listening, you're in for a treat. You'll get an opportunity to hear perspectives that I don't think you've heard before in the Portland market and in the Oregon market. So I'm excited that you all have this opportunity to hear it. I'm excited to hear what Rukaiyah has to say. So we'll start by sharing a little bit of her background, and then we'll go to Rukaiyah. So Rukaiyah Adams is the Chief Investment Officer at Meyer Memorial Trust. She is responsible for leading all investment activities to ensure the long-term financial strength of the organization. Before joining Meyer, she ran the $6.5 billion, that's billion with a B, the capital markets fund at the Standard. She started her career as a mergers and acquisition lawyer at Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom in San Francisco. So we lost her for a little while to San Francisco, but she's back, so we're thankful. Ms. Adams serves on the board of directors of Oregon Public Broadcasting and the SCI Foundation. She is the former chair of the Oregon Investment Council, the board that manages approximately $90 billion for the Oregon Public Employees Retirement Fund. In the past, she has also served on the boards of the Black Coalition on AIDS and Portland Center Stage. Her pro bono work includes negotiating on behalf of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the Homelessness Prenatal Project in San Francisco, and the National Children's Defense Fund. Rukaiyah touts one of her proudest moments as a lawyer was serving as a voter rights advocate in Ohio on Election Day 2008 with Council for Change. Ms. Adams holds an MBA with economic distinction from Carleton College and a JD from Stanford Law. At Stanford, she was on the Law and Policy Review and co-president of the Law Student Association. Rukaiyah also earned an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Welcome, Rukaiyah. What an outstanding background. Thank you for joining us this morning. What I would love to start out with, so everyone can become as familiar with you as I am, maybe share a little bit about your connection and history in Portland. Let's let them learn a little bit about your story.
Yeah, I'm a homegirl from around the way. When I hear that bio, I wonder, who is that lady? Oh my God, that's me. I have done all those things. I grew up in Northeast Portland. I'm a fourth generation Black Portlander. My great-grandparents moved here. Grew up in a neighborhood that was called Walnut Park when I was a kid. It's been gentrified and renamed Alberta Arts, but when it was Black, it was called Walnut Park. My mother still owns a house in that neighborhood. It's near MLK and Killingsworth, so it's the neighborhood just east of MLK. And went to King Elementary School and Harriet Tubman Middle School. And then from there, went to Catlin Gable for high school, and from there, Carleton College. So just deeply enmeshed in Portland. I'm the first person really in my family not to go to Jefferson. My mom went to Jeff, my cousins went to Jeff. The demos rule our family. But old Portland history, family was among the first to move here and help found Vancouver Avenue First Baptist Church. Margaret Carter's my great aunt. And when I was a little girl in elementary school at King Elementary School, the polling place at that time, this is before vote by mail, but I think there was a polling place either in King School or at Highland Church, which was nearby. And on election day, the day that Margaret was elected, I think it was 1980 or 81, my grandfather took us all out, like 10 children out of, or his 10 grandchildren out of school. And our job that day was to walk with elders from their homes to the polling place to make sure that everybody got to vote for Margaret Carter. I can remember the ballot, marking the ballot for a few of our senior community members that day. So just really old, deep family history in Portland. My grandfather was a munitions expert in World War I and Korea, and moved here to work in the shipbuilding industry. And my grandmother worked in the garment district, which became the Pearl. So as a little girl, I would play in the streets of what would become the Pearl many years later. But at the time, it was garment factories where a lot of Black women and immigrants worked. So deep connections to Portland. When I was 17, though, Orlando, and graduated from high school, I was like, dubs, Portland, I'm getting out of this one-horse town. And left thinking that I wouldn't come back. And I have to say that I didn't intend to move home. Home called me back. It wasn't an intentional thing. At the time, I was living in New York, working at a hedge fund. And I don't know if you've ever lived in New York, but the winter time in New York is pretty horrible. It's only worst thing about New York is summertime. But in the winter, we had sold this hedge fund that I was running, and I had a non-compete provision in my agreement, and really had been working my whole life, and decided to take a little bit of a break to come back and check in on my mom. She was nearing retirement here. And so I subletted my apartment in New York for the winter and came here to Portland thinking it would just be a few months to avoid the winter in New York. And I went for a run in Forest Park, and it was raining that day, and the cover of the trees was thick enough to protect me from getting wet. And the smell of Oregon in the fall, when the leaves have fallen and the humus of the earth is changing, and just that deep, natural, fresh air in my lungs, made me realize I yearned for home. And that was the beginning of a year-long process of making a decision to move back to Portland. But I stayed away for 23 years, so that's a long time.
Yeah, that's a long time, long enough, of course, long enough. You made a decision that is common for many Black professionals, individuals who grew up in this area, to leave. But before we dive deeper into that, you did leave out a portion of your background, and I would be remiss if I did not talk about your skills on the hardwood and
Right.
ability as a basketball player. We got to talk a little bit about that, because you had some game, Rukaiyah. You could actually go a little bit.
I tell you, I started playing basketball in the park, so at Irvington and Peninsula Parks, and then at Woodlawn Park with the boys when I was a tweenie. And then over the years, I just became a baller. And no doubt that was how I paid for my education, and sports were a huge part of my life. They still are. I think people would still describe me as a little bit tomboyish. But I'm a runner now. And one of my big regrets is that I didn't try to be a professional athlete. At the time I graduated from college, there was not really a big market for women athletes, but I didn't even try. And that's one of my big regrets, Orlando. But I still shoot a mean jump shot. So I'm happy to play with you guys.
Well, certainly, I know that to be true, and obviously, you're just using your athletic talents and gifts in another way now. So it still translates. You went pro, just not as an athlete.
Yeah, I went pro in money, I guess. Yeah, that's true.
That's right. That's
True.
right. So let's talk a little bit about your career. For those that are joining us on this webinar, learning to build an effective and impactful career is essential, and making decisions as you navigate through kind of the forest, as you might say, of a career and career decisions can be difficult. It can be challenging. Which direction to go? What type of education to get? So let's start with maybe your decision to study law
Mhm.
and business, and then maybe move into your work as an M&A lawyer, and how that made impact into your career, and maybe what your takeaways were from that.
Yeah, so I want to be honest. Sometimes when folks describe their career trajectory, they make it sound rational and like there was a clear, you know, articulated vision. And for some folks, there is. For me, there was not. What I did not want to be was poor.
Mhm.
And when we were growing up, Felicia Rashad on The Cosby Show, um, she was a lawyer, and she was really the only Black female professional that I saw in mainstream media, other than there were some athletes at the collegiate level at the time, like Cheryl Swoops was prominent at that time. But in terms of like careers, I didn't see anything else. And so I fixated on becoming a lawyer, not so much because I loved the law, but more because I wanted to be able to take care of myself and my family. So my first pivot professionally in applying for law school was really about financial security. But recently I went back and reread my law school application materials. I applied for some scholarships in social justice. So I may have forgotten what my drivers were at the time, that maybe I was thinking that I wanted to make a big difference in the community. And it was the student loan burden that sent my career in the direction of M&A and a private corporate practice. But what I remember most is that I didn't want to be poor, and I felt like being a lawyer was the easiest path to assuring that, and I was probably right. I mean, it certainly was easier than some of the other doctoral programs that are out there. So went to law school. I did well on the LSAT and got into Stanford. I will say that we went to school in Portland during a golden era, I think, in public education. So King and Tubman were excellent. By the time I got to Catlin Gable, I was prepared for the academic rigor of the program. And Stanford Law School was hard to get into, but I would say I felt fully prepared for the workload and the complexity of the work. But it wasn't easy, but I felt prepared for it.
Now, did you plan to practice law, or did you feel like that was a solid foundation? Many who are looking to establish their career, and they're looking at their educational pursuits, may feel like foundational studies
Yeah.
propel you into other areas. Was it your intention to practice law, or was it more of a foundational pursuit?
Well, it's interesting you say that. I did intend to practice law, and I did practice law. I mean, I didn't do the JD MBA. I did the JD. I practiced for almost 10 years and then got the MBA. So the timing was pretty, or maybe it was 7 years and then the MBA. But um, I didn't have the sort of, I want to get a law degree because I want to go into public policy or I want to go into business. Law degrees are too expensive to be foundational education. You know, they're just, especially at Stanford, where, you know, all in you're paying 80, 90 grand a year for your education. You graduate with $300,000+ in student debt. That's really expensive foundation. So no, I intended to practice, and I think just the student debt load really pushed me into the private practice. If I hadn't had student debt, I probably would have gone into something more social justice oriented, I think. But you know, you graduate with hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans, and at the time I graduated, I showed an aptitude for math, and the M&A practice is as close as lawyers get to a quantitative practice, and so that's why I ended up there. You show any capacity for math, and then you get sort of pushed into tax or M&A. And M&A lawyers are like the quarterbacks of deals. They're the ones who keep the tax lawyers, the employment lawyers, the environmental lawyers, all these kinds of people who, all these lawyers that get involved in buying and selling companies. The M&A lawyer is the quarterback for the team to try to get the deal done. So people in that role usually are more social. They have a bit more EQ. than lawyers typically do. And we're coordinators. And if deals become hostile, and toward the end of my practice, I focused on hostile takeovers, you're the muscle, and learning how to negotiate and not just legally advocate for people, but rhetorically do it, and in some ways maybe even physically influence people to do what you want them to do. By physical, I don't mean threatening them, but just learning how to take up space. So those were great years in that I learned how to negotiate, one, and to lose my fear of being threatened with lawsuits, which I needed. You need to lose that fear in order to really be successful in business. And then the other thing I think it helped me do was to think clearly. Almost all of these deals are complicated. You have overlapping jurisdictions of law. You have all these overlapping interests. There's usually, hundreds of millions of dollars involved. And they're so complex. And the ability to sit with complex issues and circumstances and really see what matters, that is the thing that I take away from those years of practicing. And then there's a kind of gravitas, kind of swagger that I think lawyers at a certain level and number of years of experience develop, that helps in business, I think.
Rukaiyah, I've heard you share one of your M&A stories that was one of the catalysts that propelled you maybe into the capital markets. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that deal and some of the fibers of that deal?
Yeah, I can't remember which one it was. I'll tell you what I remember as really being the turning point. We had done a hostile takeover in a transaction, and I was working around the clock for months, and probably months before that. But this will date me, but we finished the deal and we had to file. This was a public company. We had to do a bunch of SEC filings, and I did those filings at say 3, 4 in the morning, and maybe 5 we finished. And I walked out of the printer office to my car, and I was so tired from the work that I didn't think I could drive home safely. So I crawled into the backseat of my car. I turned on public radio and crawled into the backseat of the car to sleep for a few hours. And there was a radio show that came on the title was "This Is Your Life." And the the journalist was basically saying, I don't know why people are so miserable in the Valley. This is your life. You're in control of it. Make a change. And I think that was somewhere around 2003. And I didn't start business school until 2006. So that day I slept for a few hours in my car and went home to have a conversation with the man who would become my husband, and just said, I think I'm headed in the wrong direction. I'm clearly capable of doing this work, but this isn't my life's work, and I need to make a change. And I called my mom to talk to her about it. And a part of wanting to be a lawyer was to be able to support her and my grandmother and great grandmother till the end of their lives. And just said, hey, Mom, I got to make a change in direction. So you got to take care of yourself for a minute so that I can retool here. And that day I committed to making a change and moving into the business side. In addition to being exhausted, one thing I learned in observing these deals was that temperamentally, I felt more suited to be the boss in the deal than the advocate or lawyer or advisor on the deal. So I realized I was temperamentally not suited for an advisory role, no matter how well paid it would be. The other thing that was clear to me is that in the Valley, there were lots of Black women in service and advisory positions that were visible, but hardly any in principal positions, and making decisions about where capital goes or what technology will become prominent, or there just weren't in visionary roles, and I felt like I had that capacity. So that year, I took my first practice GMAT, and I kid you not, Orlando, I could not remember basic algebra. Like I was so arrogant that I took the test thinking I would ace it the first time. And I got my test score back, and it was something like, 90% on the verbal, and I want to say 30 or 40% on the math. It was horrible. And so I realized that I needed to touch up the math, my math training. So for the next year and a half, I'd work as an M&A lawyer by day, which was like a 12 or 15 hour day.
Yeah.
And then I would go home sit in my apartment in San Francisco and log on to a community college class, retaking algebra, geometry, and calculus and stats. So I did that. I had to humble myself and take these community college classes to just refresh the math in my mind. So I did that for a year and a half, and then the man who would become my husband tutored me in advanced calculus for probably about a year.
Mhm.
So working as a lawyer, grinding, and in the M&A practice, I cannot even tell you how much of a grind. If you think about the movie The Firm,
Yes.
I worked there and I was one of those lawyers. That's what it was like. So to come home at night and study was really tough. But I did, and I think I took the GMAT in 2007, and I'm comfortable revealing my scores. I think my verbal score was somewhere in the 99th percentile, but math was in the 96th. But it took me years of humbling myself and taking stats classes at the San Francisco Community College to get myself ready to even take the exam. So that day propelled me in a direction that I'm really glad that I was brave enough to take the step.
That's really compelling, because as we think about career development, there are certain themes that I take away from what you just shared. One, there's a level of humility and decision making that goes into that. There's also a level of risk, because at that point, as a Black woman who's climbing, moving forward in your career,
Mm-hmm.
it's a risk to take a pivot or to make an adjustment like that. And then not only is it a risk, but you're also sacrificing. So that's the other theme that I hear, one of sacrifice. And so maybe there are some aspects to your career today that those risks and those sacrifice of being a woman in a professional environment plays a part in maybe who you are today, who you've become, and how you may speak to other women about those things.
Yeah, I agree. So one of the challenges at that time when I made the pivot in 2003, I was 30 years old. And from a reproductive and social standpoint, it was time for me to be starting a family and to commit to love. And instead, I was committed to math. And and at the time, I think I abstractly understood the trade-off, that I was trading the time when my body was ready to be a mother to focus on professional training, and that was a hard trade-off at the time. I would say I have come to understand the cost of that trade-off better now. 15 years later, the thing that I think a lot of people, especially women, underestimate is how hard it is to make that choice to choose to focus on your career over, say, family, because whether or not you have kids, and when you have kids affects your parents, especially if you're their only daughter, as I am. And so the thing I didn't appreciate at 30 that I do at 45 is how much of my reproductive choices as they connect to work, how much that influences my mom's aging process, how much it influenced my soon-to-be husband. So that's one thing that I hope, as we reckon with how important women are in the workplace, in my opinion, women's participation in the workforce in the United States is actually a national security issue. It's not a gender issue. The only advantage our country has on China, maybe even India, Germany, is the productive, educated female workforce. Our men are matched 1-to-1. In fact, maybe even outmatched by those other countries, the men in those other countries. It's really American women who drive our outperformance, and we're wrestling with childcare and all these other things that we think of as gender issues when in fact they're national security issues. But when it comes to like the choice about doubling down on professional excellence at a time in your life when your reproductive choices are starting to be limited, when you think about some of the most successful Black women in the country, they made a similar choice to the one I made, right? They doubled down in those years. And it's important, but I want to be honest about the price of the ticket. And the price is not paid just by me, it's paid by my family and my husband as well. So I did make that choice. And I wouldn't say that I have any regrets. Sometimes we describe Black women as, or woe is me, I can't find a man, I'm helpless. And I feel like it was more like, woe is me, like, like I'm ready like, let's do this. So I don't have regret about it, but I do appreciate how hard it is for women in my profession to be mothers and full on, fully focused at work. It's really tough, especially during COVID. We're realizing how hard it is. But again, the country really has no choice. We've got to figure out this childcare issue. We have to figure out the reproductive issues. I speak openly with women about making choices in their lives about work and family. And we're getting better at it. We're getting better at it.
Do you feel that that decision, that choice, is helped, assisted by the corporations, by the organizations who put women in the position to have to make a decision like that? The impact of those kind of choices, particularly in the C-suite. I mean,
Yeah.
you're in the C-suite. You have that title. How do you feel that we are doing, or that organizations are doing, to facilitate one decision, one direction or the other?
I think they're doing horribly. And and we have to do better and if we don't, it'll be at our own peril. So uh, the childcare issue, for example, is a big one. Even having women's resource networks that can talk about planning a career. So I didn't get the conversation about really long-term career thinking until I went to business school. At Stanford, the women in the program, we have open conversations about whether you're going to be a professional who devotes the early part of her life to family and the later part to work, or you're going to be one who devotes the early part to work and later part to family. But it was pretty clear to us that you can't do it all at the same time. And so I was in the camp that chose work early and maybe family later. But I think we need to have those conversations more openly if we really want to retain the productivity of women for our economy, right? Not even just for our companies. I mean, just think about if half of the American workforce stopped being productive, or even 10%, the massive consequences that we would suffer from that. So I think we could do better with childcare. I think we could do better with speaking openly about fertility. I think including fertility services and health plans would really help. And then I also think COVID will push us to be more flexible about how we work, the nature of work, and hopefully that will benefit all employees, not just women, again, because this is not a feminist issue. It actually is a national security issue.
Absolutely. And I would agree with you on the COVID aspects, because right now we're in the middle of the discourse about schools and whether or not schools will be open. And one of the underlying factors, maybe one of the largest underlying factors, is how do you continue to be productive if you don't have that window of time where your kids are at school and you're at work? And so now that it becomes maybe a national issue rather than just an individual in the family structure, now maybe it gets that level of attention. But that's profound that you share that.
Yeah, so there's the business issue, the national security issue, and then as an investor, we've moved significant capital to education innovation, so education tech, because as we see this shift in the workplace, I could see the opportunity for transformative capital moving toward technology platforms that make home learning easier, ways for families to remain connected. So this kind of tectonic shift in society almost always has a corollary investment opportunity. And so we're moving pretty aggressively into education technology.
Excellent.
Meyer Trust.
And it will certainly be essential for individuals who are looking and building a career and deciding which direction to go. As you look at the way work is being done and that it's shifting, many organizations seem to be planning to maybe not go back to an office environment and to continue remote work. So it will change, but that also means that the way we work, as far as the influence of technology on that work, will be substantial in the coming years and as innovations continue to increase.
Yeah, and in addition to the real clear movement into education-based technology innovation, we are also deepening the connection of technology in our lives. I mean, this camera is revealing me to you. This way of connecting is pretty significant. So one thing that folks in the investment world have been pushing back against is how influential tech has been to our economic growth. So if you've seen Amazon run the way it has in the last few years, Facebook, Baidu, Tencent, all of the big technology companies around the world, well, the reality is that technology is penetrating deeper into our interiority.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
there's no, the asset class will not decline.
Yeah.
We are using it more and it's more
Mhm.
integrated into our lives. So
Mhm.
that's another area where I think, from an investment perspective and from a professional training perspective, I would really push people to think about what it means to have technology in our deep interior lives,
Mhm.
right? Privacy, um, efficiency, functionality, bringing the workplace home. We're headed toward a very fascinating time.
Yeah. Before we pivot, because that leads us directly into economics, wealth gaps, equity when it comes to access to those things that you just described and how we use them. But before we pivot, do you have any advice, any recommendations as you're building a career? We talked about your decisions about education, how you made the pivot and to move forward with your MBA, how that impacted your work in the M&A space and move into capital markets. We may come back to that because I do want to share some of the stories that we talked about on how you got back to Portland. But before that, you mentioned your engagement with women as far as career choices and development. What would you say are maybe some of the most impactful things that individuals should consider when developing a strong career path and having meaningful work, putting together your skills, abilities, and gifts and talents with work that's going to have impact? Any thoughts on that before we pivot?
Yeah, so on the education front, I really caution young people from thinking about their education as what they learn in the classroom. So as we have more opportunities to learn online, I think that it's great that we're democratizing access to higher education. But for me, the most important part of my graduate degrees actually wasn't what happened in the classroom. It was the people that I was learning with, right? Because you're there with them for 2 years, maybe 3 years, but then you have the next 50 years of learning with them. 20 years later, when you become executives, they're the ones who pick up the phone when you call. When you need your first break, those are the people who will help you get your first break, or if you hit hard times, they're the ones who are going to help you out. So in addition to the technical training, so much of higher education is about relationships and people and the connections. And I wish I had focused a little bit more on that when I was at Stanford. But I see now how important my peers were to my learning and educational training. So that's one point I would make. Um, the other thing I would say is I have learned to override the fear alert. When making the change from being a lawyer to being an investor, I was right at the partnership decision line, right? And if I wanted security, financial security, I certainly could have continued on the legal track, but I didn't feel excited by the work. And so I needed to override the fear of change and uncertainty in order to step into what I think is ultimately the right vocation for me. And so learning to feel the fear and do in spite of that fear is, I think, a really important emotional tool. It's not to not be afraid, it's to do it even with the fear. And then the last thing I would say that I learned more from Black women in Portland, not so much my higher education, is to just be resilient, because every day I screw something up. I get the math wrong. Someone tells me I'm an idiot. Someone gut checks me pretty much every day.
I don't know
And
if anyone's telling you you're an idiot, but I
yeah,
understand.
they do.
Okay.
Right. And there's a lot of mansplaining to me. But the key to success, I think, is just being really resilient and not getting stuck in self-critical thoughts or believing the horrible things that people will say about you. And you just have to bounce back. For me, I go for a run or I have an ice cream sandwich and I snap back into having the emotional capacity to keep going. Just keep
Excellent.
going.
Excellent. So relationships, conquering fear, and resilience.
Accepting fear.
Accepting fear. Wonderful, wonderful. Particularly in a time like this, where I mean, we talk to individuals, I talk to senior executives who maybe right now it might be the right decision for them to find a new opportunity, but the fear encapsulates them and doesn't allow them to pursue that next opportunity because of everything that's happening around the world and nationally. So.
Yeah. Now I have some advantages. So in moving from law to business, again, I didn't have kids. And to the extent that, I failed, it was really, just me. At the time, I didn't have a mortgage. So I was relatively free to make those choices. Now, with that said, my friends are watching. My classmates were watching from law school. They thought I was absolutely crazy. So many people are invested in our careers, like, being the first person in my family to go to college and then to become a lawyer. I think most people in my family envision me to be like a Supreme Court, arguing cases in the Supreme Court for the people, when really I was a corporate goon. That they had an imagination of who I was. And so even making a change in my career, I needed to have conversations with family members who were deeply invested in my identity. It wasn't even just me invested in my identity. And certainly members of this community. I mean, people had things to say for me to be that kid who made it to Stanford Law School, and to rebuke that training there were a lot of very personal conversations.
That's such an impactful statement. Thank you for sharing that. I don't think really many understand that burden. Oftentimes when you're the first in a family or you carry that level of success, how many people are invested in that? It's the only thing that I could compare it to is what it looks like on draft day for
Yeah.
professional athletes, where the whole family, it's not one person didn't make it to the NBA or the NFL or MLB. The whole family unit and the neighborhood
Yeah.
made it all together, and they all expect a certain level of performance and
Right.
success from you. That's the only comparable that I could think of to what you just said. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And I mean, to this day, I think my mom, when I told her I was going to Goldman Sachs in business school, she asked me if I was going to be a bank teller. And I was like, yeah, pretty much. $1 million at a time. Yeah. And so I don't know that she understands what I do, but she's appreciating that it's a better fit for me.
Sure, sure. Wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about what you were speaking of before. It manifested as technology and how it impacts our lives. But there's an element there because you deal with investments and money and you're watching markets regularly. There's an element that the wealth gap, that conversation continues to increase. And it's showing signs that it will continue to increase. So when we're talking about equity, there's so many eyes and ears on equity, social justice, and all of those sort of things. And they're all wonderful in their own right. They're helping move the needle. Injustices are being highlighted. There is, however, the large component of equitable success and how that looks in this country in a capitalistic society, and where you can say, well, there is no capitalism where there's no capital. And so now we find ourselves in this conversation where how do we begin to close the wealth gap and the economic deficiencies that certain communities have in dealing with equity? And I think that's one of the center conversations that has to be had. So I want to hear your thoughts on equity and economics and how financial wealth, capital all play a part in either the upliftment and enhancement of a people and also to its detriment, particularly now as we see our society moves forward.
Gosh, this is such a deep issue. This is something I really wrestle with, especially in this moment when my job is to safeguard the wealth of Meyer Memorial Trust. And I'm a wealthy person by proxy as I execute whatever we need to do to protect and grow our endowment, and to have that happening when millions of people are unemployed and hundreds of thousands of people are losing their lives to this virus. For me to be a Black woman, descendant of enslaved people whose bodies were capital, to be responsible for allocating billions of dollars of capital, it's almost, it's hard for me to even understand what my role is here. But one of the terrifying truths is that last year, Meyer Memorial Trust made nearly 28% return on its portfolio with me safeguarding it. Again, at the same time that the rest of the world is really struggling. So I can see how wealth will perpetuate itself even when my brothers and my neighbors struggle. And so with that view, and again, being someone whose body was the original capital in the American colonies, managing capital, the things that are clear to me are sometimes hard to articulate in retail politics, and which this is what led me to focus on the Albina Vision work. But we know what will close the wealth gap in the United States. We know what we need to do. We need to educate all children. We need to stop discriminating in housing, lending, and home choice. And we need to pay equal pay for equal work, right? And eliminate some discrimination in the workplace. We know what we need to do. And then Black folks need to take out insurance and pay it and then use it after people die to take care of them. The rub is that our economic system, our political economic system is not designed to be equitable. It's designed to exploit some people. And the thing that, you know, the pursuit of equity for Black people historically always included some economic component to it. But what we're seeing now in the streets of Portland, what we're seeing in some whole parts of the American South, is that we're not the only ones under the yoke now. And so what would have been, I think, articulated as an issue for cities or an issue for Black people is now something broader than that. So in seeing how wealth is extracted from people, communities, families, from my seat as a chief investment officer and allocating billions of dollars, what's really clear to me is that over time, as cities become bigger and we're more urbanized and climate change drives more of the populations to the United States population to cities like Portland, that one important feature of generating more equitable wealth will be real estate ownership and controlling the values of some of the wealthier parts of the community to drive common wealth, not just individual wealth. So that's an expression of what should be important to our economic system. The real estate, in part, is an expression of what should be important to our political system. And then really pushing for businesses and families and ownership agenda where we're not just employees and renters, but that we're owners in full participation in our economic system, not just voters in our political system. So that view that we have to own equities, we have to own real estate, we have to own our communities is what really pushed me to think, okay, 50 years out, how will this community transform? And how can we connect the Portland of 50 years from today with the Portland from 50 years ago? And that is the crux of the Albina Vision work. But the challenge, I think, for Black and brown people who struggle in a system that's extractive and really not intended to be redistributed, redistributive or equal, is that we really have to push for full education funding. We have to push for public investments in things that drive mobility, economic mobility, like transportation systems. And then we really, 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 as people of color, have to dig into some environmental advocacy, because even if we have decent jobs and we can get around, if our communities are the ones where freeways and glass factories and other pollutive industries reside, then we'll have health issues. So it doesn't really matter if we've done well financially if our health isn't good. So those are the things. There are some municipal things we need to do on transportation and education. There's some personal things we need to do with owning our homes and our small businesses. And then I think there's some community things that we need to do in controlling big swaths of land to redefine the community values that are expressed there so that they're not just individual, but they're collective.
Those are all obviously essential to maybe remedying some of the challenges and mitigating. When you think about the way that when you talk about the system that was built more extracting than it is actually contributing, you think about that, and I can't help but focus in on a couple of things that you said. When you talk about education, I know that Meyer has contributed significantly to education in Oregon. And I think that will continue to move the needle as we see organizations continue to move forward and develop schools like Kairos PDX that are contributing to inner city and Black and brown children. One of the things that I have seen Oregon struggle with is one of the things you mentioned, which is the entrepreneurial side for Black business. And Oregon has struggled greatly in that particular sense as far as doing business in a way, not that is charitable, but in a way that is more reflective of the population that those businesses might do business with. And so entrepreneurship, supporting that agenda, and there are organizations within Portland that do a good job politically. I won't name any of them. They do a really good job of lobbying for what might be considered the status quo. But when you think about Black business and how that agenda gets moved forward, and brown business, how that agenda gets moved forward, it hasn't happened as well as it has in maybe other parts of the country. Any thoughts on entrepreneurship and how we continue to develop that and provide capital in those areas so businesses can grow and give back and do some of the things that you described in the community?
Yeah. So I want to just be frank. I don't think there was ever any intention to help Black businesses succeed here. I don't think that there was the intention at the state level. I don't think there's the intention at the association level. I don't think there's the intention at the banking level. And the challenges that Black business owners and entrepreneurs face are a predictable outcome of that. Now, do I think people were trying to sabotage it? No, but I don't think there was any specific interest or effort, a coordinated or coherent effort to be thoughtful. And this is why. Those efforts all start with capital. Like, we think the intermediary organizations, banks are just intermediaries for sources of capital. Investment funds and venture funds that invest in entrepreneurs are just high-paid intermediaries. There's capital back there. There's some source of the money, whether it's a pension fund or retirement, fund of some sort, or someone like me managing foundation dollars. And behind closed doors, the source of the capital has not articulated a clear social objective that we want to achieve with capital. What we've done is layered on to investing social responsibility, and some people will describe it as impact investing, but those are layers outside of capital. What I think our generation is pushing is to redefine what capital is, that social outcomes are not layers on top of it to be executed by brokers, that the very essence of what capital is the purpose of it is to drive commonwealth. And if you define the purpose of it as driving commonwealth, and as it moves out into banks or into venture funds, then that definition is, that objective is executed by the intermediaries. And so people like me are having to step out from behind curtains. We don't like to be visible. I don't like people to know who's behind the venture capital funds or the private equity funds, because I don't want to be accountable, frankly, for what they do. But what is, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is saying to me, to my investors' ear, even if they're not articulating it in this way, is that we don't need human action to define social outcomes. We need the very purpose of our economy to be togetherness, and that we're all better off in the way that it operates, or else it will keep extracting from many and delivering to few. So that's where I'm headed, and really rethinking the source of capital. And the way that I wrap my mind around that is I manage money that Fred Meyer earned over the course of his life. And I think about the $1 billion of his that I manage today, and we've given away about $1 billion over the history of the foundation, maybe a little bit more now. But I think about those in individual dollars, in single dollar bills of someone coming into the grocery store with Fred Meyer at the till and exchanging a product for the buyer, for the consumer, and receiving a single dollar. And in that exchange between someone who needs something, especially if it was food, right? Because he was a food seller, they needed something that was essential for life. And so that bargain between the seller of food and the buyer of food is a really intimate one. It's one that's deeply, that's faith driven almost, that we buy food to sustain our bodies, right? So if there was that much trust between Fred Meyer and the consumers or the people of Portland who bought his food, then that dollar that is a part of that transaction also carries with it some moral responsibility, right? And so I can't take that dollar that Fred Meyer made and then go and steal from our neighbors who are struggling to afford housing or to throw pollution into the Willamette River. That doesn't work. So anyway, what I really try to think about is what is the moral purpose of capital, not its financial purpose, and what role do I play in pulling the chain on the capital system, the capitalist system, to more accurately reflect our values. And so we're starting to say, when we invest, I say point blank, if you're a douchebag, I'm going to fire you and I'm going to blow you up. Like, this is not going to work. I want you to hire women and promote them. I want you to hire people of color and promote them. I want you to invest in businesses run by people of color. And if you don't, I'm going to stop investing. But that's relatively new, right? That's, I'd say, the last 2 or 3 years in a 25-year career, right? So it's changing. But you got to push people like me to get off the sidelines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I want to spend our last moments together talking about Albina Vision Trust, but I want to share that I know that you're doing that because I still remember the story you told about your trip to London, I think, in your visit to Lloyd's of London. Was it Lloyd's or?
It wasn't Lloyd's, but they're reckoning with their slave history right now, which
Yes.
is funny. Yeah, it was Barings Bank.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I should just tell everybody that story.
Yeah.
When I was maybe a third year into my role at Meyer, I was in London. More than half of our money is managed outside the United States, so I do trips to London frequently. And so I was going to talk to a new manager, and they were asking us for money essentially for a strategy. And they sent me to a conference room that was called the Americas Conference Room. And in it, they had these replicas of bond issues for the American colonies. And it was essentially the slave industrial complex. This bank financed it. So it was like, cotton processing facilities, ports in Charleston and Savannah and New Orleans, all of the trains and all of the hardware. Just think about all the investment that was required to extract wealth from black people and enslaved people. Anyway, they had them framed on the wall, like, look what we did. We financed America. And I was like, did they Google me? Like, are you crazy? So we did not make the investment, and had a pretty open conversation about why they have why they're proud of this slave history and why that wasn't a good move.
Yeah.
But this was years ago, before we were so open, talking so openly about the legacy of slavery. And I actually thought I would be fired for that.
Wow. Wow.
But I was so enraged by that. But the thing is, I come across the residue of slavery in my work all the time. Those bond issues, we have insurance companies in the United States that really built their reserves on defaulting on insurance policies for Black people. Even in Portland's economy really didn't take off until Black labor arrived here in the shipbuilding industries between World War I and II. It was the Black labor force that really supercharged our economy and moved us from being a grimy little river town to a town that made stuff and shared it with the world. So I just come across it all the time, and I've learned to be more frank and show a little more grace. But it's there. You're touching it all the time. I mean, even the water you drink is an outcome of a colonial water system. There are parts of the United States that reflect the Spanish colonial law for water. In the Western United States, it's English law. And in New Orleans, it's based on French law. I mean, you're coming across it all the time.
Wow.
Anyway, so I do think about it, and I'm just more open
Hmm.
with it. And what's interesting too, when I graduated from business school, I actually struggled to get a job. I graduated at the top of my class and I couldn't get a job, as did many Black women in my class. We all struggled to get work. So some of those guys who rejected me for job opportunities then now have to come and ask me for money now.
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
It's amazing how it comes full circle that way.
you never know what's going to
Yeah.
happen in life.
Absolutely. Well, I want to hear about, I want our audience to hear about Albina Vision Trust. We have a few minutes left. Please tell us what the purposeful and meaningful work of Albina Vision Trust is and what it means to the state of Oregon.
Right. So Lower Albina was a part of the city that was really devoted to poor people. So it was like the Ellis Island of Portland. And around 1900, as Jewish people moved from Eastern Europe and Germans moved here, they settled in Lower Albina. It was in the floodplain of the Willamette River. And as African Americans moved north from the south and after the Vanport flood, Lower Albina was really where the Black population exploded in Portland. After World War II, the Germans lost. They shed their German heritage and blended into the pervasive whiteness of Portland. We stayed Black and stayed in Lower Albina. And in the 1950s, the city council basically decided to get them out of there, right? Because we needed to go. So they exercised eminent domain and bulldozed the community, lifted it and leveled it. And now the Coliseum was the result of that. Thousands of Black folks lost their homes. Most of them got $50 for their houses. And we estimate the net wealth taking by the city of Portland and the state of Oregon for the highway to be somewhere about $500 million of wealth taken. So what we're trying to do is, and by the way, that area is 94 square acres. It's huge. There's only one remaining residential property there. It's largely sports facilities and parking lots and freeways. So we're trying to push a discussion about its redevelopment with a view of building a community in Portland where the purpose is commonwealth and not just individual wealth. And that's what we're up to. And I'm so committed to that, one, because my great-grandmother, when she landed in Portland, lived in Lower Albina. Many of us, our families did, but also because I know the biggest source of wealth for Portlanders over the next 30 years will be the central city space on the river. And so I'm going to fight for our inheritance, Orlando, because they don't have to take it from us if we abandon it. And we helped build this economy. That was a critical neighborhood for us. We know what the story is about structural racism and how these freeways destroyed communities. And now it's time for us to rebuild it. And not as reparation, but as radical Black imagination and joy. Joy.
Absolutely phenomenal. I share in that vision. I believe it will be great for all Oregonians, everyone who, and also those who come and visit our city as a way to understand our history and to look forward towards our future.
Yeah.
So I am so thankful, Rukaiyah, that you were willing to share this incredibly valuable time with me. Because you do manage billions of dollars, I can say that this is an investment. Getting your time is a significant investment. So I really appreciate you sharing your career with us, sharing yourself with us, and then also sharing your vision for Albina with us as well. It has been phenomenal. Thank you so much. To all of those of you who are listening, we will be resharing this particular webinar so that you can share it with those who may not have had an opportunity to hear it. And obviously you can tell just from the value that Rukaiyah has shared with us this morning, it is definitely worth sharing with others so that they can take away what we've gotten an opportunity to take away from this. So Rukaiyah, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. We'll talk soon.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you.